Associated to infrastructural and cultural characteristics of human, geographical, and economic space where its activity is fostered. The university focuses on a global program of teaching and research, whatever its location, time, and dimension. A practice of cooperation with teaching and cultural institutions, national and foreign. Studying at University of the Azores, it's so much more. It's a privileged natural laboratory associated to the quality of life that is living, surrounded by beautiful landscapes while developing science. If you are searching for a memorable study experience, if you are looking for a truthful research experience, and if you want a remarkable personal experience, come and join us. Be part of our research teams, be part of our faculty, be part of our nature. The University of the Azores, our home, your land. Would you dare to come? Did you ever wonder how life would be like without living different experiences? Like studying planet Earth and feel its beat, its biodiversity. Feeling the breeze of our endemic forest and diving into the deepness of our oceans. Our nature inspires your studies. The University of the Azores was born Azorian, ultra-peripheral, insular, and tripolar. Circumstances that undeniably mark its history, its identity, and its mission. The University of the Azores has 3 campuses, each one committed into differentiating areas of training and research. In Terceira Island, we develop a lot of research regarding animal husbandry, biotechnology, environmental sciences, and agriculture. In Fayal, the research is much more oriented to the ocean studies, like marine biology, ecology, climate change, and so much more. In São Miguel, you can find a bit of everything, from social and humanistic studies to volcanology and seismology, continuing to medical studies and nursing. Thus, the 3 campuses of the university strengthen the development of the Azores through its strategic location, the Atlantic Ocean. It enhances the progressive knowledge associated to infrastructural and cultural characteristics of human, geographical, and economic space where its activity is fostered. The university focuses on a global program of teaching and research, whatever its location, time, and dimension. A practice of cooperation with teaching and cultural institutions, national and foreign. Studying at University of the Azores, it's so much more. privileged natural laboratory associated to the quality of life that is living, surrounded by beautiful landscapes while developing science. If you are searching for a memorable study experience, if you are looking for a truthful research experience, and if you want a remarkable personal experience, come and join us. Be part of our research teams. Be part of our faculty. Be part of our nature. The University of the Azores, our home, your life. Would you dare to come? Did you ever wonder how life would be like without living different experiences? Like studying planet Earth and feel its beat, its biodiversity. Feeling the breeze of our endemic forest and diving into the deepness of our oceans. Our nature inspires your studies. The University of the Azores was born Azorian, ultra-peripheral, insular, and tripolar. Circumstances that undeniably mark its history, its identity, and its mission. The University of the Azores has 3 campuses, each one committed into differentiating areas of training and research. We develop a lot of research regarding animal husbandry, biotechnology, environmental sciences, and agriculture. In Fayal, the research is much more oriented to the ocean studies, like marine biology, ecology, climate change, and so much more. In São Miguel, you can find a bit of everything, from social and humanistic studies to volcanology and seismology, continuing to nautical studies and nursery. Thus, the 3 campuses of the university strengthen the development of the Azores through its strategic location, the Atlantic Ocean. It enhances the progressive knowledge associated to infrastructural and cultural characteristics of human, geographical, and economic space where its activity is fostered. The university focuses on a global program of teaching and research, whatever its location, time, and dimension. A practice of cooperation with teaching and cultural institutions, national and foreign. Studying at the University of the Azores, it's so much more. It's a privileged natural laboratory associated to the quality of life that is living, surrounded by beautiful landscapes while developing science. If you are searching for a memorable study experience, if you are looking for a truthful research experience, and if you want a remarkable personal experience, come and join us. Be part of our research teams, be part of our faculty, be part of our nature. The University of Musers, our home, your life. Would you dare to come?
Boa tarde a todos. Gostaríamos de saudar e agradecer a presença de todos. Thank you, Professor Ernerst, for being with us. Sejam muito bem-vindos a mais um evento UAc Premier, em que desta vez vamos abordar uma temática de importância relevante, que é a temática da transição energética. Vamos dar início ao nosso evento com a sessão de abertura pela doutora Susana Mira Leal, magnífica reitora da Universidade dos Açores, mas gostaríamos de partilhar convosco que no final deste evento teremos um momento de convívio, um coffee and, que será um espaço para confraternizarmos, partilharmos ideias, partilharmos opiniões e aproximação ao nosso estimado orador. Muito obrigada pela vossa presença, desfrutem no momento.
Muito boa tarde, Sr. Presidente do Governo Regional dos Açores, Excelência, Sr. Vice-Presidente do Conselho Geral da Universidade dos Açores e, na sua pessoa, saúde todos os demais membros do Conselho Geral aqui presentes e também anteriores Presidentes do Conselho Geral. Estou a ver aqui o Engenheiro José Brás. Dear Professor Ernerst Moniz, Srs. Diretores Regionais da Energia e da Ciência e Tecnologia, Sr. Presidente do CESA, ilustres convidados, caros colegas, estudantes e colaboradores, familiares e amigos do professor Ernerst Moniz, é com muito gosto que hoje acolhemos no campus de Ponta Delgada o mais recente honoris causa da Universidade dos Açores, o professor Ernerst Moniz, a quem acolhemos na nossa comunidade académica na sexta-feira passada no campus de Angra do Heroísmo, com um doutoramento honoris causa na área das ciências do ambiente. Esta minha intervenção tem fundamentalmente como objetivo dar a conhecer aos presentes um pouco daquilo que é o currículo do professor Ernerst Moniz, que no fundo justifica também o facto da Universidade o ter acolhido na área das ciências do ambiente e também o receber aqui hoje para esta conferência sobre um tema da atualidade e da maior relevância nos tempos em que a sustentabilidade ambiental se faz sentir como uma emergência, uma necessidade, uma prioridade estratégica para a nossa humanidade. O professor Ernerst Moniz nasceu a 22 de dezembro de 1944, sorry, Professor Ernest, for revealing your age, em Fall River, Massachusetts, mas é neto de imigrantes, e é neto de imigrantes açorianos provindos exatamente da ilha de São Miguel, designadamente das Feteiras e da costa norte, presumivelmente da Maia. Ele formou-se em Física Nuclear pelo Boston College e doutorou-se em Física Teórica na Universidade de Stanford. Claro que eu não vou aqui dissertar sobre o currículo do professor Ernerst Moniz, porque estão certamente mais interessados na conferência dele, mas procurei apenas realçar alguns apontamentos. Foi professor no Instituto de Tecnologia de Massachusetts, MIT, entre 1973 e 2013, tendo sido chefe do Departamento de Física entre 91 e 95 e em 97, e diretor da Bates Linear Accelerator entre 1983 e 1991. A sua investigação em física concentrou-se no desenvolvimento teórico para a compreensão das interações dos eletrões e mesões da energia intermédia com os núcleos atómicos. Desde 2001, o seu foco principal de investigação tem sido a tecnologia e política energética, incluindo um papel de liderança em estudos multidisciplinares de tecnologia e política do MIT, que abordam os caminhos para um mundo com baixo teor de carbono, futuro da energia nuclear, do carvão, do gás natural e do ciclo de combustível nuclear. Esses estudos tiveram um impacto significativo na política e nos programas de energia nos Estados Unidos, e não só. Foi diretor fundador da Iniciativa de Energia do MIT e diretor do Laboratório de Energia e Meio Ambiente. Atualmente é presidente da Iniciativa de Futuros Energéticos, uma organização sem fins lucrativos dedicada a impulsionar a inovação em tecnologia energética, política e modelos de negócios. A EFI, ou seja, esta Iniciativa de Futuros Energéticos, oferece aos formuladores de políticas, executivos da indústria, ONGs e outros líderes opções sobre como avançar para um futuro energético mais limpo, seguro, acessível e protegido. É também, desde 2017, co-presidente do Conselho de Administração e CEO da Iniciativa de Ameaça Nuclear, uma organização global de segurança sem fins lucrativos e não partidária, focada em reduzir as ameaças nucleares e biológicas que ameaçam a humanidade, colaborando com governos e organizações para aumentar a consciencialização, defender e implementar soluções criativas. Em 1997, entre 1997 e 2001, Ernerst Moniz foi subsecretário do Departamento de Energia do Governo dos Estados Unidos, sob a presidência de Clinton. Foi então responsável pela supervisão dos programas científicos e energéticos do Departamento, liderando uma revisão da gestão dos mananciais de armas nucleares e atuou como negociador especial do secretário de Energia para a eliminação dos recursos nucleares russos. Entre 1995 e 1997, serviu como diretor associado para a ciência no Gabinete da Política Científica e Tecnológica do Gabinete Executivo do presidente Clinton. No governo presidido por Barack Obama, Ernerst Moniz foi o 13º secretário de Energia nos Estados Unidos entre 2013 e 2017. Nesse papel, promoveu a inovação em tecnologia energética, segurança nuclear e estabilidade estratégica. Fortaleceu a parceria estratégica do Departamento de Energia com os seus 17 laboratórios nacionais e com o Departamento de Defesa. Produziu propostas de política energética que alcançaram apoio bipartidário nos Estados Unidos e se tornaram em lei, um feito não fácil nos Estados Unidos. Liderou uma iniciativa internacional que colocou a inovação em ciência e tecnologia energética no centro da resposta global às mudanças climáticas e negociou o histórico acordo nuclear com o Irão. Além do seu trabalho no MIT, na Casa Branca e no Departamento de Energia, o professor Moniz serviu em vários conselhos de administração e comissões relacionados com a energia, com a ciência, energia e segurança, tais como o Conselho de Assessores em Ciência e Tecnologia do presidente Obama, o Comitê Consultivo de Redução das Ameaças do Departamento de Defesa e a Comissão Blue Ribbon sobre o Futuro Nuclear da América. É membro do Conselho de Relações Exteriores, da Associação Americana para o Avanço da Ciência, da Academia Americana de Artes e Ciências, da Fundação Humboldt e da Sociedade Americana de Física. Ernerst Moniz já recebeu vários prémios e distinções, entre eles o reconhecimento pela visão e liderança no avanço da simulação científica, atribuído pelo Seymour Cray HPCC Industry, as distintas medalhas de serviço público do Departamento de Defesa e da Marinha dos Estados Unidos, a Grande Cruz da Ordem de Macários III, do Chipre, e a Grande Cruz da Ordem do Infante Dom Henrique, que recebeu no Dia de Portugal, de Camões e das Comunidades, em junho de 2015. Recentemente, recebeu também da Assembleia Legislativa Regional dos Açores a insígnia autonómica de reconhecimento. Com a distinção que a Universidade dos Açores conferiu no passado dia 9, o professor Ernerst Moniz conta já com 13 doutoramentos honoris causa. Professor Moniz, welcome to our campus in Ponta Delgada, and thank you again for accepting our invitation to be here with us today and share your knowledge and experience on a topic of such crucial importance for the users and for the world. Thank you so much.
Estamos? Bem, boa tarde a todos. Sejam então muito bem-vindos a mais um evento UAc Premier e desta vez vamos debater o importante tema da transição energética. Como já deram conta, o nosso convidado, embora com origem açoriana, não domina tão bem a nossa difícil língua portuguesa, não é? Portanto, a maioria do evento vai ser em inglês, as questões vão ser em inglês e todo o debate em inglês. E então vamos também começar desta forma. Good afternoon and welcome to this crucial debate about our energy future. I will be very brief and I just want to introduce the model of this conference. That is a little bit different than normal. We will have just a short presentation from the main speaker and then we will go straight forward for the debate with the questions from the attendees. I will make the initial questions, just warm a little bit, and then you are all invited to participate. And how do you register? You need to send your name and company via WhatsApp to the register number. You need to register in UAc Guest via Wi-Fi, and then via WhatsApp you send your name and institution for that number. And of course, because we are Portuguese and something can fail, we always have another option, that is raising your hand, and I will try to identify the person. But we prefer to do it via WhatsApp. And we also are going to give respond primarily to the questions from the students, because Professor Ernerst Moniz has this thing with teaching, and then they will be the first questions to be answered. So the students put the name and identify yourselves as students. And let's start talking about our common energy future.
Yes.
Just a second. We didn't reverse this part. But, well, usually I don't like to follow a script, but in this case I just don't dare to don't follow a script, because it's a great honor to introduce a successful Portuguese and a successful Azorian. I have this challenge, this difficult challenge of trying to stand for the task of properly introduce Professor Ernerst Moniz, a successful Azorian with an important recognition of his work in the field of nuclear physics and energy. And today, he will bring to us one of our major concerns, to Europe, to Portugal, to the world, to Azores, our energy future, and the assurance of its regular and feasible supply. For us, in these very small islands, almost in the center of the Atlantic Ocean, this concern gains even greater relevance. We are all energy dependent, and we are isolated from any alternative supply. So this is a matter to handle with extreme care, professionalism, and knowledge. And without no further delay, I will give word to Professor Ernerst Moniz to learn with his presentation regarding fostering effective global energy transition strategies.
Thank you.
Climate safe and secure, please.
And I'll go to the podium. Okay?
Yes.
Well, thank you, Marco. And I do note that I think the electronic way of submitting questions already favors the young. I certainly wouldn't be able to ask a question of myself with that requirement. But thank you for that. And Madam Rector, thank you for the introduction and for the friendship that we've developed over the last, I think, days. And I thank you and all of the faculty and students of this university community for welcoming me as at least an honorary member of this group. And of course, President Bolliero of the Azores, thank you so much. And again, have many opportunities to interact with you, and really appreciate your attention and your interest in these subjects. As was mentioned, I am part of the Azorean community, descendant community of southeastern Massachusetts, Fall River. And here with my family, yesterday we managed to visit Ferteras, which is the home of my maternal grandfather, possibly grandmother, but we're not sure. And we hope maybe tomorrow to visit the home, Ribera Grande, the home of my paternal grandparents, both of them. So it is our first time here, but it's been really a wonderful reception and a wonderful opportunity to connect back to roots, if you like, and also to engage in discussions about energy and the future, a subject, again, as has been said, is obviously very central to these islands and a major challenge for these islands, with many advantages as well for these islands, which we'll come to discuss. But I will just note that the future of the islands, which benefits from this remarkable climate, subtropical, moderate climate, little bit of precipitation now and then to keep it that way, but it's so dependent upon the future of global warming and climate change, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. What I thought I would do is to start. Do I just point this somewhere? And it happens. Oh, should I hit this or use this? Okay. Oh, the other one? Oh, okay, thank you. That works. So what I thought I would do is spend some time in the context. This is in the global context, although many of the lessons then propagate down to Europe and Portugal and these islands. And I note that all of this, one can argue, has been developing rapidly in a very short time. One thing is what I called weird weather. Extreme weather, we all know, and the public broadly is recognizing that extreme weather is just getting more extreme. You all have probably read that in my part of the world, where I live now, in the northeast of the United States and the eastern coast of the United States, we are suffering, for example, enormous health and other issues from wildfires that are in Canada. And I think here you suffer as well from some of the effects. So anyway, whether it's heat, polar vortices, droughts, floods, fires, just every pestilence that one can think of is getting more extreme. And I would argue that this is ultimately going to be the tipping point for publics to really pursue and demand more rapid action on addressing climate change, on introducing the solutions to worsening climate change, which are not exclusively, but very importantly, reside with the transition to clean energy, globally, all the way down to locally. For these islands, I think the effects of global warming manifested in the extreme weather, which, as I said, I think is shifting public opinion dramatically, including in the United States, where we still have no national explicit climate policy. We do have a lot of innovation. We're kind of, to be perfectly honest, I don't want to be offensive, but kind of the flip of Europe in this sense. So if we can combine forces, then we can actually address this issue. But what I would note is that the global warming is really impacting two of the major global physical phenomena that this climate locally now really depends upon. The future of the jet stream in the atmosphere and the future of the Gulf Stream in the oceans. The jet stream, both are affected dramatically by the fact that the poles, the Arctic, the North Pole, for example, is warming much more rapidly than the equatorial regions, and that is affecting circulations dramatically in the atmosphere, and we fear will affect dramatically circulations in the oceans. So this is big time stuff, and clearly, let's face it, the Azores' relatively small population is not what's going to determine whether or not the globe successfully addresses climate change. But it's going to be very dependent on the global response, and there's no better way of encouraging that than working at all levels, including locally. Portugal is a leader in this clean energy transition. The Azores have been leading in many ways in terms of renewables. It's an advantage here, but we have a lot of work to do. Secondly, I put up here COP28. COP referring to the annual climate meetings that the United Nations holds. COP28 is this year's meeting to be held in Dubai, in the UAE. And I noted here in the sense that hopefully I'm not being overly optimistic or Pollyannish in an unrealistic way, but I think COP28 has the potential for being a turning point in these climate meetings because, first of all, of where it's being held, and secondly, because the leadership of this conference has publicly committed to pragmatism. And I believe that pragmatism, building political coalitions, is what we need if we are to stop talking past each other on climate change and start to get just roll up your sleeves action on climate change. I will just mention that 3 areas where the conversation has, in my view, turned more pragmatic in recent years, just in recent years. Number 1, in the electricity sector, which we all know is the sector everywhere that has the best low carbon performance. That's true here, of course, with many renewables, but it's true in the United States as well, for example, where we have multiplicity of ways of making electricity. But for example, coal use has dropped from 50% nationally to 20% nationally in a relatively short time, replaced by natural gas, lower carbon emissions, and renewables. However, for these islands, only the second of those is really a serious option, given the cost of natural gas. So the tools we have at our disposal will vary dramatically by place, but the idea that we will need firm power that can be delivered whenever you want it, wherever you want it, is going to be an important part of the solution, as opposed to just intermittent sources like wind and solar. Here, you have, for example, on this island, certainly well endowed with one of the firm renewable sources, geothermal power, for example. Other parts of the islands as a whole, also with some geothermal, some hydro, et cetera, in addition to wind and solar coming on in a big way. I would just argue that, again, the world has come to understand that having firm power is a big advantage to have together with the variable resources, wind and solar. Here, you will have a challenge to manage the much greater penetration of wind and solar. But it can be done, and it can be done in very creative ways, and I think that that's being thought about, it will be implemented, and I think we'll come back to this, that the islands have a tremendous opportunity with this mix of renewable resources and the opportunities for applications. I will also say that this pragmatic discussion has moved the emphasis of the climate discussion solutions in a positive way, because until recently, and I regret to say, and I'll come to this later, the Russian invasion of Ukraine has been one of the stimulants of this more rational discussion, despite the horrors, of course, of that war. But the point is, until recently, almost the entire discussion was focused on the beautiful end state that we would have decades ahead in terms of a low or no carbon energy system. Because it's much more difficult to discuss how you get from here to there. What is the transition pathway in which fossil fuels, certainly in those places that have it like the United States, natural gas in particular, but fossil fuels more broadly, are clearly going to play a major role. And we have to understand how to manage the transition to this end state where we have a fully low carbon energy system. That's all a discussion that has really been advanced just in the last few years. And I mention here as an example hydrogen in terms of, in terms of the second issue. I did only the first issue so far. Another realization is that in addition to clean electricity, we will need clean fuels. We're not going to run the system, at least globally, just on the basis of clean electricity. We will need clean fuels. Electricity may be part of that, as in making clean hydrogen, but we are going to need fuels, and I would argue that's going to apply here as well as elsewhere, even though electricity may play an even more dominant role here in these islands. If we have time, hopefully we'll come back to that. Third, I will note that in the United States, we have had a burst of legislation, which, while never saying the forbidden word climate, has actually attracted support from both parties in terms of the United States moving a major climate agenda forward. Now, that agenda, we all have something called politics. I know genteel people don't like to say that, but we have politics, you have politics, and part of the United States moving forward was, frankly, moving forward strongly, was having to satisfy the politics, which included things that were interpreted as domestic advantage in terms of manufacturing, et cetera. Well, many of those complaints, of course, came from Europe, but I would argue, in a strange way, the IRA, Inflation Reduction Act, which is up there and was a major part of the American initiative, has been a major boon to the European Union, despite the complaints, if the situation is managed properly. That is, the European Union was stimulated to do an update of the Green Deal of the European Union. Frankly, the first Green Deal back in 2019, if I may say so, didn't amount to much. The second Green Deal of this year had a lot more serious commitment of resources to manufacturing in Europe, et cetera, and to updating the rules for things like state aid, which I will say as a non-European, at least today, a non-European, have caused a lot of problems. The issue now is managing the industrial policy wrapped up in the advance of state aid rules, for example, to having those go forward in ways that stimulates innovation and manufacturing and the like in Europe, but does so without just further enhancing the abilities of the very largest economies, Germany obviously being the leading case. So there's still going to be political work to be done in Europe, but I believe that there's been a strong start, actually, with the revised Green Deal and the addressing of long-term issues, structural issues that need attention. I'm not saying it's easy, but I'm saying it's essential, and I'm somewhat encouraged by it. So now, to end up in these last couple of years, of course, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, I already mentioned, and I mentioned a little bit of its implications, but I would say now, just in a slightly different way, what the Ukraine situation has done in this context is reinforce to governments everywhere that climate change and clean energy and energy security cannot be viewed as separate discussions, as they were. And again, I don't want to pick on them, but let's take Germany as an example. On the one hand, a leader among major economies in terms of a renewable transition, and yet at the same time, not paying attention to energy security and putting itself in a highly vulnerable position, which unfortunately has now played out. So bringing those together as one conversation, I think is now another place where this has been recognized, and it's a plus, especially when you remember that in the long term, the clean energy transition and energy security work together, because there's no energy insecurity with renewables, for example. So in the long term, it's again, how do we get from here to there? And to get from here to there, we will need energy security, clean energy transition, and I would add other issues like social equity having to be viewed as one conversation. Otherwise, the publics will not follow the governments, as we have seen in many cases, and that will just make it harder to have the transition. And then finally, in this context, China, in particular, the deteriorating U.S.-China relationship obviously has implications for everybody. I won't bother to go through all of that, but I would just say that the combination of war in Europe and the China situation means that we all have an extremely unsettled and uncertain geopolitical situation with major implications for business, and I'll point to my friend Marco there, with business having major uncertainties here, and it's an issue. So that's all context for the discussion. There's been a lot of evolution of the discussion in the last couple of years, and still much more to do. Now, on the change conversation, I've already discussed the need for firm electricity, which includes the revival of nuclear in many ways, especially in Japan and the United States. Diablo Canyon is a nuclear plant in California. Carbon capture and storage are now, I'm not saying these are for the authorities, neither of those are relevant here. Storage is something that's quite relevant here, of course. We've discussed the fuels and fuel switching. We did not discuss one third element of the technology conversation that is very important, and that's carbon dioxide removal. Removing legacy carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and the upper levels of the oceans. Very important. The International Energy Agency has gotten a little bit overly enthusiastic, in my view, in saying that perhaps we should have 10 billion tons of CO2 per year eventually removed from the atmosphere and the oceans. That's kind of a lot. But the idea that we need to have negative carbon dioxide technologies is now widely recognized, and it is correct. And that is of implications for these islands, for example, because getting all the way to zero emissions, frankly, is being understood more and more as being really tough, and probably not the most affordable and economic approach as we bring down the costs of carbon dioxide removal from the atmosphere. So this will be very, very important, and I think as one comes to this micro economy, that this will have to be kept in mind as an opportunity, frankly, to reach net neutrality. The word net is very important, net carbon neutrality in a mid-century time frame. I would just note that since everyone believes anything that Bill Gates says, that he published a book a couple of years ago, I guess, How to Avoid a Climate Disaster. And I don't want, you can go out and read the book. It's actually a very short read, very easy to read. All I want to say is, I took a little editorial license, but I rearranged what he called the breakthrough technologies that were needed. And guess what? The big buckets were firm power, low carbon fuel, and carbon dioxide removal. The three things that I just said, the conversation has moved towards globally. He added to it very important non-energy system, agriculture and food, which is actually a very significant part of the greenhouse gas emissions, and also may be some of the most difficult areas to decarbonize, therefore calling for that need for the carbon dioxide removal from the atmosphere. So I think, again, the conversation is converging in this sense. I'll just make a very brief point here. I'll skip this given the time. That one, going to the bottom, as I've implied, I just want to say it very explicitly. The United States and Europe have explicitly been moving in new ways towards what is called industrial policy. I believe this move to industrial policy is absolutely essential if we are, in fact, to reach our aggressive climate goals in a timely way. Having said that, however, we cannot ignore the history that industrial policy has, shall we say, not been uniformly successful. And so, somehow or another, in this next decade, we have to figure out how to implement industrial policy in a successful way. We cannot claim to have done that, at least not uniformly for sure, for decades. We need to do it now to have any chance of reaching our climate goals. And then I'll just make one other point on supply chains. I mentioned earlier the contention between the United States and Europe in terms of the recent climate legislation. I am going to take a very optimistic, positive view. It's a good thing in the following sense. In the last decades, we collectively, especially the industrialized countries, industrialized world, have had our supply chains, broadly written, get to a state of very poor hygiene. We fail Supply Chain 101. Supply Chain 101, for example, would emphasize a diversity of suppliers. Driven by globalization, just-in-time inventories and the like, we went too far. We went so far that we violated the elementary principles of resilient supply chain development and management. My optimism is that I hope, and I'm convincing myself, that what we are seeing now, especially in this chatter between the US and Europe, is just the chaotic beginnings of what will become good supply chain management. We will understand the benefits of trade, especially among reliable partners. But I'll be even more optimistic and say that once the industrialized world has got this straight, it's also going to be a very good thing for China and may help address this tension with China. Because frankly, having China control some critical supply chains in the long term is not in their interest. It's not in their geopolitical interest, as opposed to a more stable economy. So I don't know how we get there, because we're in a very tough spot, I have to admit. But I think we should take a more optimistic view than just looking at a few random statements made by members of parliament in the United States and Europe. Okay, let me switch. How am I doing? Am I just a disaster on time, or? Okay. All right. And then I'll just. I have two more sections to do, but I'll be very, very brief. One is, I mentioned this Inflation Reduction Act in the United States as an example of how to address these needs for climate. And I'm not going to say a lot. I'll just say that the ideas you should take from this similarities to the European Green Deal. These acts do reduce greenhouse gas emissions. For the United States, 37% from 2005. They do increase jobs. Roughly speaking, the legislation that we are following in Europe and the United States are driving the things we want to go up, and the things we want to go down. That's a good thing. The Inflation Reduction Act, there's one exception. Inflation is not reduced, despite the name of the act. However, the overall picture is a good one, in which we still expect inflation in 2024 in particular to come back down closer to the kinds of levels that Europe and the United States expect. I could go through that. I could talk about how the central banks in both places are giving us misreadings of what inflation is. That the reality is, while prices climbed for all of us dramatically over a year, they have not been climbing that dramatically, at least in the United States, for a good 6 months. And so we need to change our mindset, and that will affect how we approach the climate challenge. Okay, and let me end by just saying a few things on hydrogen. I mentioned hydrogen earlier as one of the ways of providing low or no carbon fuel services. I think hydrogen, and I know others here with whom I've spoken here in Terceira and San Miguel, understand and are looking at hydrogen, clean hydrogen, in particular with all the renewables here, and sometimes the major problems of fitting renewable supply to demand. There may be lots of opportunities to make zero carbon hydrogen which can then have many, many applications. Hydrogen, I like to say, is like carbon-free natural gas, in the sense that it can serve many sectors. It can be used in electricity generation. It can be used as a fuel for vehicles. It can be used as a fuel for some air travel. It can be used in industrial processes. It's extremely flexible. Today, it's too expensive. Costs are coming down, and the legislation that we've been discussing will drive those costs further down. Maybe I'll just end by saying that in Tessera, for example, I had a discussion with the head of the Chamber of Commerce, which was interesting, just as an example of how this and other developments can impact these islands directly. If one looks at the development of technology for short flights, air flights, it's happening much faster than many are recognizing. We are seeing battery-powered airplanes literally start flying short distances, but inter-island here, you have short distances. We are seeing hybrid airplanes in which batteries are recharged by the conventional engine, but especially in landing the aircraft. They are happening right now and improve efficiency enormously. And now hydrogen, we are seeing tremendous interest, including from the major airlines, including like Airbus, et cetera, looking at hydrogen and fuel cells as being better than batteries in terms of driving, especially. They're looking at long-haul aviation as well, but I would argue it's a much better place to start with the short-haul aviation, and these islands could be a major beneficiary and driver, frankly, of those markets. There is, of course, the issue of making fuels, liquid fuels for aircraft that are low carbon. Here, there is in these islands, there is substantial use of animal waste, for example, to power. That can be used today to make also advanced aviation fuels. Cost has to come down there. But the point here is, and of course there are the ideal sustainable aviation fuels that are made in other ways for current engines, but I would argue the first set of options I denoted is far more advanced and may be getting ready to start implementation, especially in a region with lots and lots of short-haul aircraft requirements. So anyway, there's other examples of technology. We've talked about connecting different islands electrically, really hard. It would be a great benefit, but it's really hard and really expensive today. But we should always keep looking at the technology developments that are happening with a clock speed that we never anticipated before, and you don't want to get caught behind. These islands have both an opportunity and a challenge, as I mentioned. Opportunity with the renewable resources especially, challenge with the isolation of relatively small communities, especially in the other islands, other than San Miguel. But it's exciting, it's important, we have to do it. We have to get these technologies affordable and scalable, otherwise the global climate system will get dramatically disrupted in ways that are certainly very detrimental here locally. I speak for my colleagues at MIT, my colleagues at the Energy Futures Initiative, and other colleagues everywhere. We are certainly very interested in the challenges that the Azores presents, that the decarbonization broadly presents, and we will certainly be happy to continue working with all of you in realizing solutions, especially if that entails traveling back to the islands relatively frequently. Thank you. Sorry, I went so long.
No.
I get into it.
Then we are going to move to the questions. And thank you, Professor Ernerst Moniz, for your brilliant presentation. And to start this period of questions and replies, I don't know if you recall an important statement from relevant physics that was like this: I am a physicist, so I am an optimist. Professor Ernerst Moniz, Mission Innovation Feed 2017. Looking at the present world situation, do you maintain this statement from that period?
Yes, I do. I gave a little bit of a hint of it here, but if you look at what is happening scientifically and technologically, it clearly is happening at speeds that were not anticipated. Cost reductions. Of course, the classic example is solar panels, where the cost has gone from sky high, and I mean literally sky high, as in NASA satellites, to practically nothing for the panels themselves. And batteries are coming down, and electrolyzers are coming down to make hydrogen and all of that. There is, however, the place where my optimism is challenged, is the social license to deploy all of these technologies at large scale. I'll just speak for the United States and let you speak for Europe and the Azores. But if you look at the United States, for example, to meet our one of the slides that I did not show in terms of modeling how the legislation works, to meet our climate goals of about 50% reduction of greenhouse gas emissions by 2030, we need to deploy 500,000 to 600,000 megawatts, 500 gigawatts, 600 to 600 gigawatts of wind and solar in roughly a decade. It turns out, if you look at the historic building rate of wind and solar in the United States, you're not off by very much if you can do it year after year after year. The problem is the best sites were the first ones taken. And now, even though people recognize the importance of deploying these renewables, especially wind, there's a lot of social resistance being generated at putting up these wind farms. And then, if you respond to that, let's say in Massachusetts we have some issues with building especially offshore wind farms, let's say. Other places have it for onshore. But if you now say, okay, look, I give up, I'm not going to put the wind farms there or there, I'll put them in remote places of Nebraska where there's lots of wind, and then I'll build a lot of high voltage transmission lines to deliver it to the cities. Well, now the problem is the public objects to building the transmission lines. We have got a challenge of figuring out how the infrastructure can be built fast enough with social license to construct. That, to me, much more than technology, is now the challenge.
Yes, I believe we have the same issue here.
I'm sure. I think it's everywhere,
Yes.
except where there's a government you wouldn't want to have.
Yes. No, that's also a problem here in having the social resistance and also the complement of all the legislation and the time consuming of
Yes.
that project.
You know, Marco, let me just add, in the United States now, to license a project and get it built is taking about a decade. Well, how do you build 500 gigawatts in a decade if it takes you a decade to build one
And how you
facility.
keep the
So
private companies interested in spending all
And-
that time to
correct.
make it.
And in fact, if I may take on that, another challenge, in my view, is, and it's exactly what you said, if the project does not look like it can complete, you cannot get the financing because the financial risks are just
high.
much too great.
Yes.
You know, the debt and equity financing will be impossible to get. So we need to get all of, that's the coalition. We need the financial community, the energy community, the entrepreneurial community, the governments coming together and saying, what is a pragmatic way of getting this done?
Yes. And before we start to give the opportunity for the audience, I still have one last question. And considering your Azurian roots, how do you imagine the energy future in the source, taking into account our significant constraints related to geographic isolation? That is an issue in the source. We are really in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, far away from everything. And also another problem is the geographical discontinuity. We are 9 islands. Just comparing Azores and Madeira, it's a huge difference how we can manage the problems because we are 9 islands with different necessities. Also very small islands, then they don't have the scale. And we strongly believe that these issues represent a considerable challenge for the different players involved in the energy sector. An example of this challenge is, for instance, EDA, the electricity producer in the Azores, that has to face the increased difficulty of managing 9 different and isolated microgrids and assure sustainable and feasible production and distribution of energy. We have this problem also in Europe with different countries, but this problem gains even more relevance because we are 9 islands, isolated, the production systems are isolated, they are not connected, and this is a challenge to connect, also energy connect these islands. And we have to find some other alternatives that you also mentioned in your presentation.
Well, first of all, wanting to always look on the bright side, you can say, well, you have the advantage of being in the forefront of things like microgrids and distributed energy, et cetera. Now, obviously, there are always advantages of scale if one can accumulate larger communities, and maybe there'll be some technology development that makes it reasonable to connect the islands electrically, all 9 islands. Maybe you start with 2 islands that are well positioned to do that. But look, I think the bottom line is there just seems to be lots of additional renewable potential, certainly here on these islands, and I think that there's a major system optimization that's going to be needed to match those renewables. I mean, geothermal is good because it is dispatchable, but wind and solar in particular, and hydro as well, but wind and solar. And so, for example, look, I have to say that an obvious opportunity for these islands is in a significant electrification of transportation. But for a microsystem, it probably wants to, A, be able to use the time dependence of producing electricity, like at night, for charging. It probably also wants to develop the optionality, at least, of vehicle to grid.
Yeah, there's a project like that.
So, I mean, I think when you have a small system, it's all about the system integration, assuming you have the starting point of things like strong renewable sector. So I think there's a lot of possibility there. Again, I would not lose sight of the fact there's got to be a multi-decadal transition. That's absolutely critical. And this is not a defeatist statement. And don't forget carbon dioxide removal as an option for getting that last, especially for getting that last bit where you want to go, let's say to net zero, for example, as the European Union will, at some level, dictate. So anyway, I think there are options there, but there is a lot of development left to do for all of those issues I mentioned. They've been addressed, but they have not been addressed in a way that I think really serves a major community in a reliable, resilient, affordable way. But in the meantime, EU subsidies can help the affordability.
Then we have here first question. I will ask for to go to Professor José Azevedo, that is right there, and give him the microphone.
Okay, thank you. So I have, in fact, two questions. I will start with one. In your speech, I think you are assuming this paradigm that we must keep the amount of energy we consume and just change where it comes from towards a net zero thing. Some would argue, and I tend to agree with them, that in the present context, in many areas of our economies and in many countries, what we need is to degrowth in many areas, including the amount of energy we consume. So I would like to have your view on that.
I violently agree with you, and I should have said, and I did not, that aggressive energy efficiency is certainly the starting point. Certainly, speaking for the United States, the opportunities are essentially across the entire economy. And a place which is really important is with buildings. There's at least, again, I would guess here as well, but I certainly know in the United States, buildings, residential and commercial buildings, are about 1/6 of our total energy use, and that energy is not being used very efficiently at all. So there are big opportunities there. Now, if one does reach the point where, and actually I don't know, you should tell me, to what extent is heating required? I mean, this seems to be a very moderate climate, so I would think that there is maybe some residual electrical heating possibility when it's needed. Certainly higher up in the mountains, there would be some need, I would assume. But if one can get all of that to zero carbon, then frankly, the efficiency in the buildings isn't quite as important, although it's still very helpful because any excess electricity you free up can be used for these other purposes, in terms of transportation, in terms of potentially hydrogen in the future. So yeah, so efficiency, energy efficiency conservation, absolutely essential.
And please, you feel free, anyone, because we have in the audience people from HEDA, I'm seeing there, and people from the renewable, people from the transports, from the boat transports, and you can participate from the industry, and you can participate at any time. Regarding even the question from the Professor Ernerst Moniz, I believe we don't have a problem with heating our houses, but we have really unsustainable houses still. We are improving our construction, but they are still very inefficient. And it's also the transport. It's also another big issue in Azores that we are giving the first steps. There is the Director of Energy. We are now beginning to have more preeminent cars, electrical cars, and points of charge. That was an effort from the government to place all these solutions.
Plug-in hybrids.
Yes, plug-in hybrids. Yeah, the cars, exactly. We drove one of those. And I will give the word to Professor Vasco Garcia, that was raising his hand. I don't know if you can go with the micro.
Thank you very much, Professor Moniz. I appreciated your presentation very much, but in a certain way, I was surprised that you didn't focus very much on what I think, and many people around the world, specialists, engineers, ecologists, think is the future of electrical production, and that is nuclear energy. My question will be very short. What do you think in this era of energy transition about the future of the molten salt fuel reactors, which I think are in fact the biggest step of the energy transition to the future? Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. First of all, I had nuclear on the slide, but I chose not to talk about it because certainly today's nuclear power plants would not be an option, obviously, here, given the scale. But if I, first of all, speak more broadly, I certainly agree, I think, with the implication of your question that nuclear power is going to be an important part of the response to climate change. As I mentioned, for example, even in the United States, it was quite surprising that the Diablo Canyon plant, which is 2 large light water reactors, 2,200 megawatts, were supposed to close in 2024 and 2025, and they've now been announced to be continued in operation for years. I'll give you an anecdote just to reinforce this point, and then I'll go to your specific question. The governor of California, many probably know, is Gavin Newsom. He's the one who signed the change in direction for Diablo Canyon. The negotiation to close Diablo Canyon occurred around 2017, and a major driver was the chairman of the, I forget what's exact, the Ocean Commission. I forget exactly the name of the commission. The chairman of which was a gentleman named Gavin Newsom. So he had to completely change his position, and he did. And I would argue it wasn't because he grew to love nuclear power. It's because when suddenly one is facing the need for reliable, resilient, carbon-free power, it's kind of persuasive. So I think that realization is occurring. Certainly internationally, environmental groups have changed their message quite a bit on nuclear, much more positive, understanding that it's part of the climate solution. Now, in terms of future technology, so those who don't realize, today's technologies everywhere is based upon a light water system that cools the reactor and moderates the neutrons, but that's getting a bit technical. There are now a new class of nuclear reactors that are much smaller. They're called small modular reactors. Yeah, SMRs. And some of them, for example, there are 2 in the United States still based upon light water. One of them is 70 MeV in size, maybe approaching a size that becomes relevant or not. But these are a major part of the future. However, in the SMRs, there's another class of reactor, technically it's called Generation 4, which are different types of reactors which are not deployed, and it's not worth mentioning exceptions today, among which is something called molten salt reactor. And here, a molten salt, it could be a chloride salt or a fluoride salt, has tremendous heat storage capacity and has some advantages in terms of safety, etc. So, so the question was about these. First of all, the good news, I would say, well, the news is that molten salt reactors are making progress towards being licensed. I expect there will be one built in Canada, for example, maybe among the first. However, one of our problems, it's again this human problem, the nuclear regulators everywhere know how to regulate light water reactors. They still have to learn how to regulate any other kind of reactor. And this is a bit of a problem. Oh yes, I mean, you're shaking your head, but I can assure you it's a bit of a problem.
I'm shaking my head because I know what's behind. You know.
Yeah.
This okay. Thank you very much.
Yeah. But it's just that again, the regulators today feel uncomfortable. They're learning, and the question is, how long will it take to learn? Number one. Number two, I would just go back to a broader statement. The light water reactors, whether they're big or small, operate at rather low temperatures, around, let's call it 300 degrees centigrade. And consequently, the heat, it can be used, but it's not very useful, because higher temperature heat is always preferred. These Generation 4 reactors, like molten salt, can operate maybe at 550 degrees centigrade. And that heat could accommodate 60% of all of the industrial uses of heat. So, in my view, if for no other reason, we need to keep developing these reactors, because they may have much broader application besides electricity to also providing very high quality heat for industrial processes. Not all of them. You won't make steel with that temperature, but you'll do all your pharmaceutical work, for example, with that temperature, as one example. So, yeah.
Now, just one question before, that is from Paul André, from EDA, then I will pass the word to you. No, back there, Paul André, where is your...
Okay, thank you. I enjoyed a lot your presentation, because how can I say, we acknowledge that some of the questions that you think that are important are the ones that we are facing and trying to solve with our day-to-day basis. It's a simple question. We believe that the main difficulty that we have now, it's not technology, it's costs. We have technology available to do whatever we want. But the problem of this equation is the cost that we will achieve with these solutions. What do you think about the necessity of big public funding to try to to make possible to these projects to appear and to have replications of the projects, and this is the only way to lower the costs of these solutions? Sorry for my English.
No.
Just before you answer, Paul André and that area are from EDA, the company that produces and makes the distribution of energy in the source. And they know what is these issues about producing and electricity in different kinds of islands with these different environments.
Yeah, I would...
Excuse me. I thank you, Professor. I represent the private shareholders of EDA, the investors in EDA. What do you think about the transportations of energy between islands? Because the techniques and all the people say to us that it's so much expensive, so dangerous with our sea, that this is not a good business. What do you think about transportation of energy between Ponta or Santo Michael and Terceira, or Terceira and to Graciosa, because some people say that the answer of our energy problems in Azores is put the energy from Santo Michael in Santa Maria and Terceira in Graciosa, or Terceira to Curve. Thank you.
Maybe Paulo André primeiro, and then the second.
Yeah, so
try to connect
they're
them.
related somewhat. First of all, I personally would not express your question exactly the way you expressed it, in the following sense. I would not say the technology is available, but the cost is too high. If the cost is too high, the technology is not available. And that's where the cost reduction is part of technology innovation. Now, experience, as you emphasized, is also a big part of it. Scaling is a big part of it. Learning by doing is a big part of it. And that's where I agree with your assertion that, and that is the philosophy that we are following in the United States, and I think the European Green Deal is also looking at, namely, we are going to need public support for first of a kind, second of a kind, third of a kind demonstrations, with the hope that costs will be coming down to the point where the public no longer supports the activity. Let me give you, as a specific example, let me go back to the question that was asked on nuclear power. Clearly, nuclear power in many places, as we know, has not satisfied budget constraints very well. In the United States, we are just finishing up, for the first time in a long time, 2 new nuclear power plants, 2,200 megawatts. The cost ended up more than double the initial budget. Crazy. Future technology, these small modular reactors, I mentioned some of their features, but another feature is they are being designed. The word modular is there because they are being designed so that, let's say, at least ideally, the entire nuclear part of the facility can be built in a factory and not in the field. If you build in a factory, that's how you learn. Every manufacturing industry has always had tremendous cost reduction by manufacturing more. The question is, how do you get over the hump? If you're Boeing or Airbus, you amortize the costs of developing the first one over the first 200 sales. You don't do that with a nuclear power plant. So we need a way to have the public support come in to be able to ramp down the costs in a way that the private financial markets will see the risk reduced to a place where they can invest. Because right now, today, in the United States, and I think in Europe as well, there is much more capital available than there are clean energy projects in which the private sector will invest. The money is waiting because the risk is too high. And so I think the job of the governments is to understand that and to design programs for risk reduction of private capital coming in. That's really the key. That's perhaps a segue to the second question, which I may have already answered actually with that comment. This cost reduction through learning and through technology development has to go hand in hand. And it's very important that there be a feedback loop, which up to now has been very weak in the clean energy space, of when projects are built, the information flows back to the policymakers, to the technologists, to the financiers, to understand what to correct going forward. I'll give you an example. I was the Secretary of Energy of the United States. And one thing that I failed at, I'll admit to only one, of course, was that because of the way the government procurement rules were, when we supplied half the money to build a new clean energy facility, the company that put the other half in would keep all the information to themselves. I'll be perfectly honest. I had a real problem. I do not understand why the public should invest money in these plants and not get some benefit to make the next one cheaper, as opposed to the company keeping all of that. And there's always a line to be drawn. But those are the kinds of practical examples that we need to make clean energy financeable at the scale that we need to deploy all of these technologies. And we're not there. We're not there in the United States. I don't think you're there in Europe. And the government's perspective has to change, that it's all about financeability in the end.
And now, because we have a...
Mr. President.
And because we have a tight schedule and we have the coffee hand in the end where we can share some thoughts together in a more relaxed way. Just some final remarks. Well, energy, it's everything. And in the current present, we already have in Azores a lot of potential balanced mix of renewable sources of energy, since geothermal, we have the wind, we have the waves, we have the tides, we have hydro. We just need to still think a little bit what is the best solution for the Azores. And these moments of reflection are also very important for us to think about the different solutions. And also have always the concern of trying to find a solution that can be transportable for the other islands. Some way of energy production that can be storage and that can be transport to be available.
And I would just add, don't forget hydrogen,
yes,
or hydrogen carriers, ammonia, etc. Mm-hmm. In fact, I didn't say this, but for the island, sorry, but
no,
going on.
That's the right.
But for example, it's possible that, I think for the islands, as much as one can do domestic, local production, mm-hmm, the better. Like, for example, with excess renewables, et cetera, going into green hydrogen, mm-hmm, with many, many uses. But in addition, there's developing the favorite solution today for transporting hydrogen over long distances is to put it into something like ammonia, yes, or methanol. So if those markets develop, then that's, mm-hmm, something for the islands also to be coupled into, mm-hmm, in a strong way. And of course, there's no problem with inter-island transport of those energy sources, as opposed to electricity, which is much more of a challenge. Yeah. But also in terms of transportability, I would just add, this may not be your highest priority, but I think there's also potentially a much broader service to others that can be done by solving the energy problem in bounded areas. Mm-hmm. So I think it's to help yourself, and it's also, frankly, to have something that can have much wider implications.
Then I have to thank Professor Ernerst Moniz for this time with us. and also thank you for being such a resilient audience. And I invite you for the coffee and to share some thoughts in a more relaxed way. Thank you once again.
Okay.